Chapter 2, Part 3 of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Bobby. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. Chapter 2, Part 3. Stephen was once again seated beside his father in the corner of a railway carriage at Kingsbridge. He was travelling with his father by the night mail to Cork. As the train steamed out of the station, he recalled his childish wonder of years before and every event of his first day at Clongowes. But he felt no wonder now. He saw the darkening lands slipping past him, the silent telegraph poles passing his window swiftly every 4 seconds, the little glimmering stations, manned by a few silent sentries, flung by the mail behind her and twinkling for a moment in the darkness like fiery grains flung backwards by a runner. He listened without sympathy to his father's evocation of Cork and of scenes of his youth, a tale broken by sighs or draughts from his pocket-flask whenever the image of some dead friend appeared in it, or whenever the evoker remembered suddenly the purpose of his actual visit. Stephen heard, but could feel no pity. The images of the dead were all strange to him, save that of Uncle Charles, an image which had lately been fading out of memory. He knew, however, that his father's property was going to be sold by auction, and, in the manner of his own dispossession, he felt the world give the lie rudely to his fantasy. At Maryborough he fell asleep. When he awoke, the train had passed out of Mallow, and his father was stretched asleep on the other seat. The cold light of the dawn lay over the country, over the unpeopled fields and the closed cottages. The terror of sleep fascinated his mind as he watched the silent country, or heard from time to time his father's deep breath or sudden sleepy movement. The neighbourhood of unseen sleepers filled him with strange dread, as though they could harm him, and he prayed that the day might come quickly. His prayer, addressed neither to God nor saint, began with a shiver, as the chilly morning breeze crept through the chink of the carriage door to his feet, and ended in a trail of foolish words which he made to fit the insistent rhythm of the train, and silently, at intervals of 4 seconds, the telegraph poles held the galloping notes of the music between punctual bars. This furious music allayed his dread, and, leaning against the window-ledge, he let his eyelids close again. They drove in a jingle across Cork while it was still early morning, and Stephen finished his sleep in a bedroom of the Victoria Hotel. The bright warm sunlight was streaming through the window, and he could hear the din of traffic. His father was standing before the dressing-table, examining his hair and face and moustache with great care, craning his neck across the water-jug and drawing it back sideways to see the better. While he did so, he sang softly to himself with quaint accent and phrasing, "'Tis youth and folly makes young men merry, so here, my love, I'll no longer stay. What can't be cured, sure, must be endured, sure, so I'll go to America. My love, she's handsome, my love, she's bonny, she's like good whiskey when it is new, but when 'tis old and growing cold, it fades and dies like the mountain dew." The consciousness of the warm sunny city outside his window, and the tender tremors with which his father's voice festooned the strange, sad, happy air, drove off all the mists of the night's ill humour from Stephen's brain. He got up quickly to dress, and, when the song had ended, said, "That's much prettier than any of your other camalias." "Do you think so?" asked Mr. Dedalus. "I like it," said Stephen. "It's a pretty old air," said Mr. Dedalus, twirling the points of his moustache. "Ah, but you should have heard Mick Lacy sing it. Poor Mick Lacy! He had little turns for it, grace notes he used to put in that I haven't got. That was the boy who could sing a Come All You, if you like." Mr. Dedalus had ordered drisheens for breakfast, and during the meal he cross-examined the waiter for local news. For the most part they spoke at cross-purposes when a name was mentioned, the waiter having in mind the present holder, and Mr. Dedalus his father, or perhaps his grandfather. "Well, I hope they haven't moved the Queen's College, anyhow," said Mr. Dedalus, "for I want to show it to this youngster of mine." Along the Mardyke the trees were in bloom. They entered the grounds of the college, and were led by the garrulous porter across the quadrangle. But their progress across the gravel was brought to a halt after every dozen or so paces by some reply of the porter's. "Ah, do you tell me so? And is poor Pottlebelly dead?" "Yes, sir, dead, sir." During these halts Stephen stood awkwardly behind the two men, weary of the subject, and waiting restlessly for the slow march to begin again. By the time they had crossed the quadrangle his restlessness had risen to fever. He wondered how his father, whom he knew for a shrewd, suspicious man, could be duped by the servile manners of the porter, and the lively southern speech which had entertained him all the morning now irritated his ears. They passed into the anatomy theatre, where Mr. Dedalus, the porter aiding him, searched the desks for his initials. Stephen remained in the background, depressed more than ever by the darkness and silence of the theatre, and by the air it wore of jaded and formal study. On the desk before him he read the word fetus, cut several times in the dark stained wood. The sudden legend startled his blood. He seemed to feel the absent students of the college about him, and to shrink from their company. A vision of their life, which his father's words had been powerless to evoke, sprang up before him out of the word cut in the desk. A broad-shouldered student with a moustache was cutting in the letters with his jackknife, seriously. Other students stood or sat near him, laughing at his handiwork. One jogged his elbow. The big student turned on him, frowning. He was dressed in loose grey clothes, and had tan boots. Stephen's name was called. He hurried down the steps of the theatre so as to be as far away from the vision as he could be, and, peering closely at his father's initials, hid his flushed face. But the word and the vision capered before his eyes as he walked back across the quadrangle and towards the college gate. It shocked him to find in the outer world a trace of what he had deemed till then a brutish and individual malady of his own mind. His recent monstrous reveries came thronging into his memory. They, too, had sprung up before him, suddenly and furiously, out of mere words. He had soon given in to them, and allowed them to sweep across and debase his intellect, wondering always where they came from what den of monstrous images, and always weak and humble towards others, restless and sickened of himself when they had swept over him. "Ay, bedad, and there's the groceries, sure enough," cried Mr. Dedalus. "You often heard me speak of the groceries, didn't you, Stephen? Many's the time we went down there when our names had been marked, a crowd of us, Harry Peard and little Jack Mountain and Bob Dyas and Maurice Moriarty, the Frenchman, and Tom O'Grady and Mick Lacy, and that I told you of this morning, and Joey Corbett and poor little good-hearted Johnny Keevers of the Tanteels." The leaves of the trees along the Mardyke were astir and whispering in the sunlight. A team of cricketers passed, agile young men in flannels and blazers, one of them carrying the long green wicket-bag. In a quiet by-street a German band of 5 players in faded uniforms and with battered brass instruments was playing to an audience of street Arabs and leisurely messenger boys. A maid in a white cap and apron was watering a box of plants on a sill which shone like a slab of limestone in the warm glare. From another window open to the air came the sound of a piano, scale after scale, rising into the treble. Stephen walked on at his father's side, listening to stories he had heard before, hearing again the names of the scattered and dead revellers who had been the companions of his father's youth. And a faint sickness sighed in his heart. He recalled his own equivocal position in Belvedere, a free boy, a leader afraid of his own authority, proud and sensitive and suspicious, battling against the squalor of his life and against the riot of his mind. The letters cut in the stained wood of the desk stared upon him, mocking his bodily weakness and futile enthusiasms, and making him loathe himself for his own mad and filthy orgies. The spittle in his throat grew bitter and foul to swallow, and the faint sickness climbed to his brain, so that for a moment he closed his eyes and walked on in darkness. He could still hear his father's voice. "When you kick out for yourself, Stephen, as I dare say you will one of these days, remember, whatever you do, to mix with gentlemen. When I was a young fellow, I tell you I enjoyed myself. I mixed with fine, decent fellows. Every one of us could do something. One fellow had a good voice, another fellow was a good actor, another could sing a good comic song, another was a good oarsman or a good racket-player, another could tell a good story, and so on. We kept the ball rolling anyhow, and enjoyed ourselves, and saw a bit of life, and we were none the worse of it either. But we were all gentlemen, Stephen, at least I hope we were, and bloody good honest Irishmen, too. That's the kind of fellows I want you to associate with, fellows of the right kidney. I'm talking to you as a friend, Stephen. I don't believe in playing the stern father. I don't believe a son should be afraid of his father. No, I treat you as your grandfather treated me when I was a young chap. We were more like brothers than father and son. I'll never forget the first day he caught me smoking. I was standing at the end of the south terrace one day with some menines like myself, and sure we thought we were grand fellows because we had pipes stuck in the corners of our mouths. Suddenly the governor passed. He didn't say a word, or stop even. But the next day, Sunday, we were out for a walk together, and when we were coming home he took out his cigar-case and said, "By the by, Simon, I didn't know you smoked," or something like that. Of course I tried to carry it off as best I could. "If you want a good smoke," he said, "try one of these cigars. An American captain made me a present of them last night in Queenstown." Stephen heard his father's voice break into a laugh which was almost a sob. "He was the handsomest man in Cork at that time. By God, he was! The women used to stand to look after him in the street." He heard the sob passing loudly down his father's throat, and opened his eyes with a nervous impulse. The sunlight breaking suddenly on his sight turned the sky and clouds into a fantastic world of sombre masses with lake-like spaces of dark rosy light. His very brain was sick and powerless. He could scarcely interpret the letters of the signboards of the shops. By his monstrous way of life he seemed to have put himself beyond the limits of reality. Nothing moved him or spoke to him from the real world unless he heard in it an echo of the infuriated cries within him. He could respond to no earthly or human appeal, dumb and insensible to the call of summer and gladness and companionship, wearied and dejected by his father's voice. He could scarcely recognize as his own thoughts, and repeated slowly to himself, "I am Stephen Dedalus. I am walking beside my father, whose name is Simon Dedalus. We are in Cork, in Ireland. Cork is a city. Our room is in the Victoria Hotel. Victoria and Stephen and Simon. Simon and Stephen and Victoria. Names." The memory of his childhood suddenly grew dim. He tried to call forth some of its vivid moments, but could not. He recalled only names: Dante, Parnell, Clane, Clongowes. A little boy had been taught geography by an old woman who kept 2 brushes in her wardrobe. Then he had been sent away from home to a college. In the college he had made his first communion, and eaten Slim Jim out of his cricket cap, and watched the firelight leaping and dancing on the wall of a little bedroom in the infirmary, and dreamed of being dead, of mass being said for him by the rector in a black and gold cope, of being buried then in the little graveyard of the community off the main avenue of limes. But he had not died then. Parnell had died. There had been no mass for the dead in the chapel, and no procession. He had not died, but he had faded out like a film in the sun. He had been lost, or had wandered out of existence, for he no longer existed. How strange to think of him passing out of existence in such a way, not by death, but by fading out in the sun, or by being lost and forgotten somewhere in the universe. It was strange to see his small body appear again for a moment, a little boy in a grey belted suit. His hands were in his side pockets, and his trousers were tucked in at the knees by elastic bands. On the evening of the day on which the property was sold, Stephen followed his father meekly about the city from bar to bar. To the sellers in the market, to the barmen and barmaids, to the beggars who importuned him for a lob, Mr. Dedalus told the same tale, that he was an old Corkonian, that he had been trying for 30 years to get rid of his Cork accent up in Dublin, and that Peter Pickackafax beside him was his eldest son, but that he was only a Dublin jackeen. They had set out early in the morning from Newcombe's coffee-house, where Mr. Dedalus's cup had rattled noisily against its saucer, and Stephen had tried to cover that shameful sign of his father's drinking bout of the night before by moving his chair and coughing. One humiliation had succeeded another, the false smiles of the market sellers, the curvettings and oglings of the barmaids with whom his father flirted, the compliments and encouraging words of his father's friends. They had told him that he had a great look of his grandfather, and Mr. Dedalus had agreed that he was an ugly likeness. They had unearthed traces of a Cork accent in his speech, and made him admit that the Lee was a much finer river than the Liffey. One of them, in order to put his Latin to the proof, had made him translate short passages from Delectus, and asked him whether it was correct to say tempora mutantur nos et mutamur in illis, or tempora mutantur et nos mutantur in illis. Another, a brisk old man, whom Mr. Dedalus called Johnny Cashman, had covered him with a confusion by asking him to say which were prettier, the Dublin girls or the Cork girls. "He's not that way built," said Mr. Dedalus. "Leave him alone. He's a level-headed thinking boy who doesn't bother his head about that kind of nonsense." "Then he's not his father's son," said the little old man. "I don't know, I'm sure," said Mr. Dedalus, smiling complacently. "Your father," said the little old man to Stephen, "was the boldest flirt in the city of Cork in his day. Do you know that?" Stephen looked down and studied the tiled floor of the bar into which they had drifted. "Now, don't be putting ideas into his head," said Mr. Dedalus. "Leave him to his Maker." "Yarra, sure, I wouldn't put any ideas into his head. I'm old enough to be his grandfather, and I am a grandfather," said the little old man to Stephen. "Do you know that?" "Are you?" asked Stephen. "Bedad I am," said the little old man. "I have 2 bouncing grandchildren out at Sundays. Well, now then, what age do you think I am? And I remember seeing your grandfather in his red coat riding out to hounds. That was before you were born." "Aye, or thought of," said Mr. Dedalus. "Bedad I did," repeated the little old man. "And more than that, I can remember even your great-grandfather, old John Stephen Dedalus, and a fierce old fire-eater he was. Now then, there's a memory for you." "That's 3 generations, 4 generations," said another of the company. "Why, Johnny Cashman, you must be nearing the century." "Well, I'll tell you the truth," said the little old man. "I'm just 27 years of age." "We're as old as we feel, Johnny," said Mr. Dedalus. "And just finish what you have there, and we'll have another. Here, Tim, or Tom, or whatever your name is, give us the same again here. By God, I don't feel more than 18 myself. There's that son of mine there, not half my age, and I'm a better man than he is any day of the week. Draw it mild now, Dedalus. I think it's time for you to take a back seat," said the gentleman who had spoken before. "No, by God," asserted Mr. Dedalus. "I'll sing a tenor song against him. or I'll vault a 5-barred gate against him, or I'll run with him after the hounds across the country as I did 30 years ago along with the carry boy and the best man for it." "But he'll beat you here," said the little old man, tapping his forehead and raising his glass to drain it. "Well, I hope he'll be as good a man as his father, that's all I can say," said Mr. Dedalus. "If he is, he'll do," said the little old man. "And thanks be to God, Johnny," said Mr. Dedalus, "that we lived so long, and did so little harm." "But did so much good, Simon," said the little old man gravely. "Thanks be to God we lived so long, and did so much good." Stephen watched the 3 glasses being raised from the counter as his father and his 2 cronies drank to the memory of their past. An abyss of fortune or of temperament sundered him from them. His mind seemed older than theirs. It shone coldly on their strifes and happiness and regrets, like a moon upon a younger earth. No life or youth stirred in him as it had stirred in them. He had known neither the pleasure of companionship with others, nor the vigour of rude male health, nor filial piety. Nothing stirred within his soul but a cold and cruel and loveless lust. His childhood was dead or lost, and with it his soul capable of simple joys, and he was drifting amid life like the barren shell of the moon. "Art thou pale for weariness of climbing heaven and gazing on the earth, wandering companionless?" He repeated to himself the lines of Shelley's fragment. Its alternation of sad human ineffectualness with vast inhuman cycles of activity chilled him, and he forgot his own human and ineffectual grieving. Stephen's mother and his brother and one of his cousins waited at the corner of quiet Foster Place, while he and his father went up the steps and along the colonnade where the Highland sentry was parading. When they had passed into the great hall and stood at the counter, Stephen drew forth his orders on the governor of the Bank of Ireland for 30 and £3, and these sums, the moneys of his exhibition and essay prize, were paid over to him rapidly by the teller in notes and in coin respectively. He bestowed them in his pockets with feigned composure, and suffered the friendly teller, to whom his father chatted, to take his hand across the broad counter and wish him a brilliant career in after life. He was impatient of their voices, and could not keep his feet at rest. But the teller still deferred the serving of others to say he was living in changed times, and that there was nothing like giving a boy the best education that money could buy. Mr. Dedalus lingered in the hall, gazing about him and up at the roof, and telling Stephen, who urged him to come out, that they were standing in the House of Commons of the old Irish Parliament. "God help us," he said piously, "to think of the men of those times, Stephen, Healy Hutchinson and Flood and Henry Grattan and Charles Kendall Bush, and the noblemen we have now, leaders of the Irish people at home and abroad. Why, by God, they wouldn't be seen dead in a 10-acre field with them. No, Stephen, old chap, I'm sorry to say that they are only as I roved out one fine May morning in the merry month of sweet July." A keen October wind was blowing round the bank. The 3 figures standing at the edge of the muddy path had pinched cheeks and watery eyes. Stephen looked at his thinly clad mother, and remembered that a few days before he had seen a mantle priced at 20 guineas in the windows of Bernardo's. "Well, that's done," said Mr. Dedalus. "We had better go to dinner," said Stephen. "Where?" "Dinner," said Mr. Dedalus. "Well, I suppose we had better, what?" "Some place that's not too dear," said Mrs. Dedalus. "Underdone's?" "Yes, some quiet place." "Come along," said Stephen quickly. "It doesn't matter about the dearness." He walked on before them with short, nervous steps, smiling. They tried to keep up with him, smiling also at his eagerness. "Take it easy like a good young fellow," said his father. "We're not out for the half-mile, are we?" For a swift season of merrymaking, The money of his prizes ran through Stephen's fingers. Great parcels of groceries and delicacies and dried fruits arrived from the city. Every day he drew up a bill of fare for the family, and every night led a party of 3 or 4 to the theatre to see Ingomar or the Lady of Lyons. In his coat pockets he carried squares of Vienna chocolate for his guests, while his trousers pockets bulged with masses of silver and copper coins. He bought presents for everyone, overhauled his room, wrote out resolutions, marshalled his books up and down their shelves, pored upon all kinds of price lists, drew up a form of commonwealth for the household by which every member of it held some office, opened a loan bank for his family and pressed loans on willing borrowers, so that he might have the pleasure of making out receipts and reckoning the interests on the sums lent. When he could do no more he drove up and down the city in trams. Then the season of pleasure came to an end. The pot of pink enamel paint gave out, and the wainscot of his room remained with its unfinished and ill-plastered coat. His household returned to its usual way of life. His mother had no further occasion to upbraid him for squandering his money. He too returned to his old life at school, and all his novel enterprises fell to pieces. The Commonwealth fell, the loan bank closed its coffers and its books on a sensible loss. The rules of life which he had drawn about himself fell into desuetude. How foolish his aim had been! He had tried to build a breakwater of order and elegance against the sordid tide of life without him, and to dam up, by rules of conduct and active interests and new filial relations, the powerful recurrence of the tides within him. Useless. From without, as from within, the water had flowed over his barriers. Their tides began once more to jostle fiercely above the crumbled mole. He saw clearly, too, his own futile isolation. He had not gone one step nearer the lives he had sought to approach, nor bridged the restless shame and rancour that divided him from mother and brother and sister. He felt that he was hardly of the one blood with them, but stood to them rather in the mystical kinship of fosterage, foster-child and foster-brother. He burned to appease the fierce longings of his heart before which everything else was idle and alien. He cared little that he was in mortal sin, that his life had grown to be a tissue of subterfuge and falsehood. Beside the savage desire within him to realize the enormities which he brooded on, nothing was sacred. He bore cynically with the shameful details of his secret riots, in which he exulted to defile with patience whatever image had attracted his eyes. By day and by night he moved among distorted images of the outer world. A figure that had seemed to him by day demure and innocent came towards him by night through the winding darkness of sleep, her face transfigured by a lecherous cunning, her eyes bright with brutish joy. Only the morning pained him with its dim memory of dark orgiastic riot, its keen and humiliating sense of transgression. He returned to his wanderings. The veiled autumnal evenings led him from street to street as they had led him years before along the quiet avenues of Blackrock. But no vision of trim front gardens or of kindly lights in the windows poured a tender influence upon him now. Only at times, in the pauses of his desire, when the luxury that was wasting him gave room to a softer languor, the image of Mercedes traversed the background of his memory. He saw again the small white house and the garden of rose-bushes on the road that led to the mountains, and he remembered the sadly proud gesture of refusal which he was to make there, standing with her in the moonlit garden after years of estrangement and adventure. At those moments the soft speeches of Claude Melnotte rose to his lips and eased his unrest. A tender premonition touched him of the tryst he had then looked forward to, and, in spite of the horrible reality which lay between his hope of then and now, of the holy encounter he had then imagined, at which weakness and timidity and inexperience were to fall from him. Such moments passed, and the wasting fires of lust sprang up again. The verses passed from his lips, and the inarticulate cries and the unspoken brutal words rushed forth from his brain to force a passage. His blood was in revolt. He wandered up and down the dark slimy streets, peering into the gloom of lanes and doorways, listening eagerly for any sound. He moaned to himself like some baffled, prowling beast. He wanted to sin with another of his kind, to force another being to sin with him and to exult with her in sin. He felt some dark presence moving irresistibly upon him from the darkness, a presence subtle and murmurous as a flood filling him wholly with itself. Its murmur besieged his ears like the murmur of some multitude in sleep. Its subtle streams penetrated his being. His hands clenched convulsively, and his teeth set together as he suffered the agony of its penetration. He stretched out his arms in the street to hold fast the frail swooning form that eluded him and incited him, and the cry that he had strangled for so long in his throat issued from his lips. It broke from him like a wail of despair from a hell of sufferers, and died in a wail of furious entreaty, a cry for an iniquitous abandonment, a cry which was but the echo of an obscene scrawl which he had read on the oozing wall of a urinal. He had wandered into a maze of narrow and dirty streets. From the foul laneways he heard bursts of hoarse riot and wrangling and the drawling of drunken singers. He walked onward, undismayed, wondering whether he had strayed into the quarter of the Jews. Women and girls dressed in long vivid gowns traversed the street from house to house. They were leisurely and perfumed. A trembling seized him, and his eyes grew dim. The yellow gas flames arose before his troubled vision against the vapoury sky, burning as if before an altar. Before the doors and in the lighted halls groups were gathered, arrayed as for some rite. He was in another world. He had awakened from a slumber of centuries. He stood still in the middle of the roadway, his heart clamouring against his bosom in a tumult. A young woman dressed in a long pink gown laid her hand on his arm to detain him and gazed into his face. She said gaily, "Good night, Willie dear." Her room was warm and lightsome. A huge doll sat with her legs apart in the copious easy-chair beside the bed. He tried to bid his tongue speak that he might seem at ease, watching her as she undid her gown, noting the proud, conscious movements of her perfumed head. As he stood silent in the middle of the room, she came over to him and embraced him gaily and gravely. Her round arms held him firmly to her, and he, seeing her face lifted to him in serious calm, and feeling the warm calm rise and fall of her breast, all but burst into hysterical weeping. Tears of joy and relief shone in his delighted eyes, and his lips parted though they would not speak. She passed her tinkling hand through his hair, calling him a little rascal. "Give me a kiss," she said. His lips would not bend to kiss her. He wanted to be held firmly in her arms, to be caressed slowly, slowly, slowly. In her arms he felt that he had suddenly become strong and fearless and sure of himself. But his lips would not bend to kiss her. With a sudden movement she bowed his head and joined her lips to his, and he read the meaning of her movements in her frank, uplifted eyes. It was too much for him. He closed his eyes, surrendering himself to her, body and mind, conscious of nothing in the world but the dark pressure of her softly parting lips. They pressed upon his brain as upon his lips, as though they were the vehicle of a vague speech. And between them he felt an unknown and timid pressure, darker than the swoon of sin, softer than sound or odour. End of chapter 2.